November 1944, 3rd Army Headquarters near Metz, France. Rain falls on the canvas tents, turning the camp into a sea of deep gray mud. Clerks and administrative officers move through dry, wooden corridors inside a requisitioned stone building, sorting mounds of white paperwork. Among the stacks of standard military logistics reports sits a new directive stamped with the highest level of official priority. It is not an order for gasoline, ammunition, or winter boots. It is a strict numerical restriction on the acknowledgement of human bravery. The document establishes a firm mathematical cap on the number of combat decorations allowed for the month. A soldier who risked everything yesterday will receive nothing today because a ledger has been closed. General George S. Patton reads the paper in silence, his fingers tracing the inked limits. He intends to shatter the cold mathematical formula with a sharp, calculated act of defiance. This is the story of what Patton did when a medal quota denied a Silver Star to a soldier who destroyed a machine gun nest. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the order that came from a desk, not a foxhole. Staff Sergeant William Pulaski was 24 years old. He came from the heavy industrial neighborhoods of Detroit, Michigan, where he worked the steel foundries before answering the call to arms. Pulaski served in the vanguard of the 3rd Army, leading an infantry squad through the mud, hedgerows, and concrete fortifications of France. He was a quiet man, hardened by months of relentless forward movement and the loss of 3 close childhood friends who had crossed the Atlantic with him. His boots were caked in dried loam, his field jacket torn at the shoulder, and his hands scarred from grease and barbed wire. He knew the precise, heavy cost of clearing a path toward Germany, millimeter by millimeter. On an icy morning late in October, Pulaski had charged forward alone into a hail of automatic fire, single-handedly neutralizing a fortified German machine gun position that had pinned his entire platoon against a muddy embankment. Colonel Frederick Hayes was 46 years old. He came from an old, established family in Richmond, Virginia, and occupied a pristine, heated office within the Awards Division at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Hayes wore a perfectly tailored wool dress uniform with sharp creases, highly polished leather shoes, and spotless brass insignia that had never seen a speck of trench mud. He viewed the entire European theater not as a clash of blood and iron, but as a massive exercise in administrative management. To Hayes, heroism was an asset that required strict regulatory oversight to maintain its market value. He firmly believed that without rigid numerical limitations, field commanders would hand out medals like candy, cheapening the prestige of the decorations. His system valued the theoretical integrity of the spreadsheet over the flesh and blood sacrifices of the infantrymen. He sat at his desk, dipped his fountain pen in black ink, and drew a thick line through the stack of field recommendations. By November 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had transformed into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. The rapid dashes of the summer had vanished, replaced by cold rain, thick mud, and fortified German defensive networks like the Maginot Lines around Metz. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the Normandy beaches, creating a severe shortage of artillery shells and fuel. Every foot of ground required immense effort, and the casualty lists grew longer each day. Yet, as the fighting intensified, a different kind of crisis developed within the rear echelon offices of the Supreme Command. Bureaucrats, far from the front lines, began to treat the materials of war, including the recognition of valor, with the same strict rationing applied to gasoline and food rations. In previous campaigns, senior commanders routinely approved decorations based entirely on the field recommendations of company officers who witnessed the fighting firsthand. This approach ensured that immediate, conspicuous bravery received swift validation while the actions were fresh. However, as the theater expanded, administrative staff at high headquarters grew concerned with standardization across multiple armies. They feared that different Army commanders maintained wildly varying criteria for what constituted a Silver Star or a Bronze Star. To enforce uniform standards, the staff implemented a rigid quota system that distributed a fixed number of medals to each Army, based solely on total personnel strength. This mathematical model completely ignored the actual intensity of combat sectors. An Army holding a static, quiet line along a river received the exact same allotment of decorations as an Army launching daily frontal assaults against concrete pillboxes. Other senior generals accepted the new administrative regulations with quiet compliance, prioritizing bureaucratic harmony over frontline morale. They allowed the paperwork to pile up, leaving the courage of their men unrecorded. The systemic blockage remained completely unchallenged until the new quota restrictions landed directly on the desk of the 3rd Army commander. Captain Thomas Miller sat behind a folding table in the damp command tent, tapping his fountain pen against a stack of official combat citations. Across from him stood Colonel Frederick Hayes, who was methodically checking figures against a large, leather-bound accounting ledger. Miller cleared his throat and slid a thick piece of paper across the dark wood. "This is the recommendation for Staff Sergeant William Pulaski," Miller said, his voice flat from exhaustion. He took out an active machine gun nest, with nothing but a trench knife and 2 grenades, saving 30 men from certain death. Colonel Hayes did not look up from his ledger. He turned a page, adjusted his spectacles, and ran a manicured finger down a column of neat blue ink numbers. "The calculation is complete for the current cycle," Hayes replied. "The allocation for the 3rd Army has already been entirely exhausted for the current period." Miller leaned forward, his knuckles turning white against the edge of the desk. "Colonel, the man ran 70 yards through open crossfire to save his platoon," he said. "The calendar does not change the fact that his actions merit the Silver Star." Hayes closed the ledger with a dull, heavy thud that puffed a small cloud of dust into the damp air. "If we do not maintain strict administrative discipline, the value of the decoration is entirely ruined," Hayes said. "If every Army commander hands out medals for every standard firefight, these ribbons become completely worthless pieces of cloth." Miller stared at the senior officer, his face tightening. "This was not a standard firefight, Colonel. The men who died on that hill did not die according to a monthly schedule." Hayes stood up, smoothing the front of his unblemished wool tunic. "Regulations exist to ensure uniformity across the entire European theater." Hayes said, "The 3rd Army must learn to manage its decoration budget just like its fuel allocations." Miller picked up the unsigned paperwork, his teeth clenched. "I will ensure this file goes directly to the commanding general," Miller said. Hayes offered a brief, dismissive smile as he picked up his fountain pen. "You may send it wherever you wish, Captain, but the math remains final." The report reached Patton within the hour. What Patton did, when a medal quota denied a Silver Star to a soldier who destroyed a machine gun nest, November 1944. 3rd Army headquarters near Metz, France. Rain falls on frozen mud while clerks type names onto thick white paper. Across the Western Front, thousands of men crawl through freezing water and dodge artillery bursts to hold the line against a desperate enemy. Inside a heated office building, a different kind of war is waged with ink and red pens. A new directive sits on a wooden desk, stamped with the seal of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. It dictates that heroism is no longer judged by blood and sacrifice. Instead, valor managed by a monthly calendar and a strict mathematical formula. One young sergeant faces the reality that his survival and his courage mean nothing to a spreadsheet. George S. Patton Jr. is about to find out that a clerk has rationed the honor of his fighting men. His response will shatter the comfortable routine of the desk officers, who think courage can be measured like bags of flour. Patton stared at the colonel from Richmond for 5 seconds. The room remained completely silent. Then the general reached into his desk and pulled out a fountain pen. He did not sign the denial order. Instead, He pulled out a stack of fresh citation forms and began writing in a sharp, heavy hand. He filled out the paperwork for the Silver Star, but he did not use the current date. He wrote November 1st, 1944. He backdated the document to bypass the filled quota. He then wrote an extended, highly detailed narrative of the action that guaranteed the award could not be dismissed by the review board. The general stood up, walked around the large map table, and handed the papers to his adjutant. He ordered the officer to process the award immediately under the new month's allotment. He then picked up a sheet of heavy headquarters stationery. He dipped his pen and wrote a personal commendation letter directly to the sergeant from Detroit. His hand moved quickly across the page. He signed his name with 3 sharp underlines. He folded the paper, placed it inside an envelope, and walked out the door toward his waiting staff car. The mud of the French countryside flew from the tires as the jeep sped toward the forward positions of the infantry division. Patton arrived at the muddy field kitchen where the company was resting. The men stood at attention in the freezing rain. The general walked straight to the young sergeant. He looked at the dirty uniform and the tired eyes of the combat veteran. He pulled the personal letter from his coat. He did not wait for an official ceremony. He handed the envelope directly to the sergeant in front of the entire assembly. The men watched in silence as the general spoke. The staff officers from SHAEF were miles away in their warm offices, completely unaware that their spreadsheet had just been torn apart in the mud. Staff Sergeant William Pulaski did not talk about that afternoon in the rain near Metz after he returned to Detroit. He went back to the assembly line, married his high school girlfriend, and raised 3 children in a small brick house on the east side of the city. The delayed Silver Star arrived in a plain brown cardboard box walked through the mail, in the spring of 1946, but he had kept it inside a velvet-lined case in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser. He worked 34 years for the Chrysler Corporation, before retiring to a small cottage near Lake Huron, where he spent his days fishing in silence. He passed away quietly in August of 1988, leaving the personal, hand-inked commendation letter from the general to his oldest grandson. Colonel Frederick Hayes remained with the awards division until the winter of 1945, when he was quietly reassigned to an administrative post in Panama. He left the military in 1948 and returned to Richmond, where he built a successful career as an executive for a regional insurance company. He frequently spoke at civic luncheons about the necessity of institutional efficiency and organizational discipline in modern warfare. He died in 1974, convinced until his final hours that his mathematical formula had preserved the dignity of the United States military decoration system. General Patton never entered the dispute into his official war diary, but he kept a carbon copy of the backdated citation in his private personal files, until his death in December of 1945. In a private letter to his wife, Beatrice, he noted that the greatest enemies of the fighting soldier were not always found across the firing line. He wrote that a man who fights with an ink pen can kill the spirit of an army faster than an artillery barrage. November 1944, 3rd Army Headquarters near Metz, France. Rain falls onto the muddy canvas of a command tent where clerks type on heavy steel machines. Stacked inside a wooden crate sit hundreds of typed commendations for American soldiers who risked everything in the mud. A cold wind rattles the tent poles as an officer stamps a thick red line across a pile of paperwork. He rejects the stack, not because the men failed, but because a monthly ration has expired. A young clerk looks at a citation for a soldier who crawled through machine gun fire to save his friends. The clerk places the paper into a box marked denied. The paperwork stops because a spreadsheet says heroism has a monthly limit. General George S. Patton will discover this bureaucratic barrier and dismantle it with calculated precision. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have accepted the administrative directive from Supreme Headquarters? Or would you have filed a formal protest through channels instead of engineering an immediate backdoor solution. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the order that came from a desk, not a foxhole, make sure to subscribe.